Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, May 15th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, environmental change can turn rare risks into immediate problems, and the Army Corps of Engineers is stepping in to manage the consequences. Plus, testing new technology is one thing, but making it work in the field and getting people to trust and use it is another. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The growth of shared services for grants across government has climbed steadily over the last 5 years. Through the Grants Quality Service Management Office, 29 agencies are using standardized technology services to help award more than $1.2 trillion a year. With more on how the Grants QSMO plans to further drive standardization into grants management, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, joins me now. Jason, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Terry.
What is the Grants QSMO doing these days to further evolve how services are delivered by agencies?
The Grants QSMO is moving away from a traditional process to find vendors to update its shared services marketplace. This is something they've been doing for years. They put out a request for information, they review these vendor submissions, and then they go, look, we have new people in the marketplace. Instead, what the Grants Shared Services is doing is really they're going to be using a special item number, a SIN, under the GSA schedules. Andrea Sampanis is the director of the Grants QSMO in the Department of Health and Human Services, and she says that change is part of how the grants marketplace really has evolved over the last few years.
This allows us to be a living commercial marketplace with ongoing intakes and an evaluation. Previously, with the RFI effort, it was a really big spike. You all only maybe had 3 to 4 weeks to respond. And then we had some very fun summers trying to review all of the submitted documentation. We're hoping this can even it out. It allows you to take the time, really understand what we're looking for. That's another piece. We got feedback from vendors, more transparency in what we're looking for. And the SIN method gives us all of that.
Now, Sampanis says the SIN will be added as part of GSA's refresh coming in June. GSA already previewed some of these changes in Mass Refresh 32 a few weeks ago in a notice to agencies and vendors alike, saying it will be SIN 518210GM. I know for those of you keeping track at home. Now, Sampanis says the SIN also includes several subgroups as a way to expand the standardized service options for agencies.
First being the core award management solutions. That really is the core amount of where the grant spends its most time in the application intake, review, award issuance of the notice of award, the modification of the award sometimes, and closeout. Big end-to-end, lots of requirements there on interfaces. It is currently what is really the scope of our commercial marketplace catalog that you hear us talk about. However, we've expanded that scope to include another subgroup, which we've termed additional GM solutions and services. There's a lot in that. These are just examples of what could be in there: single audit support, transaction processing support. Those could be additional services you need. Subrecipient monitoring, NOFO simplification. Again, just some examples. The next one is grants management technology operations services. We were sort of taking a look at where a lot of that spend is happening, and we know many of you need O&M support of your systems. So that is, there's sort of one focused on O&M, help desk, system integrations, implementation services.
Now, Sampanis said also grants performance management services will be added as another subgroup in the near future as well.
Jason, this all sounds a little complicated for folks who don't live in this world every day. What are the benefits of this change in approach?
There are several benefits for both agencies and vendors alike. First off, for agencies, which have been, they've been trying to modernize these core grant systems for many, many years. Now they have one place to find all the qualified vendors, but it's more than just having the one place. They also can compete a contract to modernize those systems. Now, Sampanis says the SIN will help streamline acquisitions for everyone involved.
Another thing we've heard from our agencies is that they're looking for not just sort of the core award management system, but they're also looking for services, be that PMO support, risk assessment. We've had a whole slew of questions coming in saying, hey, do you have market research on this? Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't, but either way, the SIN allows us to expand the scope of that marketplace. and really reflect your capabilities that many of you have been coming to us and saying you want it on the marketplace, and look at these capabilities we have. It allows us to scale, as I mentioned, be transparent, and have consistent vendor engagement. That was a big thing. We had received feedback from vendors in the past to say, could you let us know sort of what your expectations are, what your requirements, what your evaluation criteria are.
Now, additionally, grant shared services are already helping save thousands of hours of time because agencies are sharing resources. But maybe more importantly, the SIN will give agencies a lot of confidence knowing that they can buy this service. It's already been checked out and approved by, and that these vendors know what the standards are that they're following. They already know all about the changes outlined in 2 CFR 200, which OMB, as you know, updated last year. Now, finally, Sampanis says moving to the SIN will actually help grant recipients as well.
By creating the SIN, and where we were purposeful in where we chose to put the SIN, it's open to cooperative purchasing agreements, which means state, local governments, tribal governments, territories are all able to buy off of this SIN. Many of those, probably all of those, are grant recipients. So they may have a need for a system. And if they do, this is an open avenue. Of those, there's 50,000 grant recipient organizations. Now, not all of them are states, local governments, tribes, territories, but there's a significant amount of our funding going to those groups. A recent AGA survey conducted found that 75% of recipients use simple or no technology systems. That could mean, for instance, manual processing, or maybe souped up SharePoint site to manage this. And the requirements are getting more complex. As we seek to fight fraud and improve subrecipient reporting, there's being a lot asked of our prime recipients.
What exactly will vendors have to do in order to get into this new system with the SIN?
It's not such a straight thing like, okay, I can just apply. There's actually something called the Grants Capability Framework. And this is something that this is developed by the Grants CUSMO to help ensure consistency, not just across grant systems, but also it's really close to financial management systems as well. Sampanis describes the framework's 3 big main areas.
We start out by adopting everything that's in the Grants Management Federal Integrated Business Framework, FIBF. That starts with the functions and activities, which is really the taxonomy. So we talk about the process with the same words. That's the business use cases, which talks about the different user stories. We will continue, as we have in the past, to use these as the basis for our system demos. We've added a little bit to those, though, as we will be asking for demos, for instance, to show where maybe some of the forms get pulled in or the integrations get pulled in. They do cross different scenarios, too, maybe a disaster grant for one and a research grant for another. Third is the business capabilities. This is very exciting, hopefully, for our developers. It's defined input, process, output.
We have a link to that framework on federalnewsnetwork.com, make it easy to find. But the other thing, Terry, that's really important about this framework is that it's not just at a high level. It really goes a step deeper. It breaks down grants data standards, the standard forms for grant recipients, and even the CUSMO created an API library, which actually was at the request of many vendors. Now, again, all of this is part of that capability framework that's going to help drive that standardization. Now, finally, the CUSMO has outlined an evaluation criteria for the SIN as well, and this cuts across business, technology design, technology operation, programmatic, economic, and organizational requirements. And one last thing, vendors and I think agencies will notice a lot of similarities with the financial management CUSMO and its SIN. The FM CUSMO and GSA established that financial management services SIN back in April of 2022. So again, a lot of similarities. They're building on top of something that's already there, but it's a little different. So I think that's something that Andrea really was highlighting.
So, Jason, it sounds like she's tackling a lot of much needed improvement in the grants management system here.
I think this is something that's been ongoing, a big need for quite a while. And I think they're at the place now where they have the systems, the technology, but also the will to really kind of say, hey, here's where you can find this information. Here's where you can find the systems, the solutions to make grant management better. And of course, the big push on fraud, all of this plays into this move toward shared services and standardization.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for bringing us this information.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, environmental change can turn rare risks into immediate problems, and the Army Corps of Engineers is stepping in to manage the consequences. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize, secure operations, and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Glacier-related flooding is becoming more frequent and more dangerous in parts of the country, prompting the Corps to step in with targeted mitigation efforts. We hear how that work is unfolding on the ground from Mike Reckards and Daryl Downing with the Army Corps of Engineers on site in Alaska. Mike and Daryl, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Terry. Thanks so much for having us. We're really happy to be here.
Mike, I want to start with you. We're talking about glacier flooding in Alaska. That doesn't seem like a Corps of Engineer project to me, but what's changed on the ground there in Alaska that has made this particular issue something the federal government and the Army Corps of Engineers thought they needed to step in and address?
Yeah, Terry, this is a really interesting, challenging, and complex problem that is really something that the Army Corps is uniquely able to jump in and address. And I'll just start by basically describing the problem here. So these are glacier lake outburst floods, which we abbreviate as GLOF for short. And basically what's going on here is the Mendenhall Glacier is changing, and it's been changing since the end of the Little Ice Age. It's been getting thinner, and it's also been retreating. And as it's been retreating, people have been building where it used to be. And you can think of a glacier as a river. It's a river of ice. And much like a river or like a tree, it has branches. And as the glacier changes, these branches also change. These branches of ice that flow into the main stem, into the trunk of the glacier. And so what we have here is one of these tributary branch glaciers has actually retreated out of the valley that it was inhabited, and it's left behind this overdeepened basin that is now dammed by the main stem of the Mendenhall Glacier. And that overdeepened basin fills with water, and when it fills up completely, it then suddenly releases and produces a dramatic flood looks a lot like a flash flood or a dam break flood in terms of its profile. It's really sudden, rises really fast, and retreats really fast, and it's changing every year too because of the continued changes of the Mendenhall Glacier. And so just that it's just developed in the last 15 years. It's gotten way more severe in the last few years, and we really, as an agency and with our partner agencies and the really unique skill set that we have in our centers of excellence and our ability to respond to emergencies, it's a project that we're really perfect for addressing in coordination with our sponsors and the other agencies here.
Daryl, Mike just said that the glacier's been changing since the Ice Age, although a little bit more dramatically recently. What is it about the current conditions today that make this kind of flooding even more dangerous than it's been in the past?
Well, yeah, thanks, Terry. So over the last few years, the water seems to be flowing out a lot quicker, and there's a lot more volume that's coming out of the glacier, which is flowing down the river and coming out of its banks. So under the Corps of Engineers Public Law 8499 program, we're authorized to help prepare, respond, and recover from specifically flood response or flooding issues that are impacting communities. So what we've been doing the last couple of years is kind of helping the city and borough of Juneau prepare their flood response activities by providing a lot of flood fight materials. For example, temporary flood barriers, sandbags, super sacks, pumps. Over the course of the last year, the city and borough of Juneau have been kind of ramping up efforts to protect a little bit more of the river upstream and downstream of key critical infrastructure and private properties. This year, the Corps was requested and is now implementing the construction of these temporary flood barriers to help mitigate these flooding impacts that have been getting worse over the last several years.
And Mike, Daryl's talking there about immediate flood response barriers and boundaries. When you think about the medium and long-term solutions to this, what do you see from a hydrological perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that what makes this situation kind of unique is although flooding occurs all around our nation and the world, this sudden onset is unique here, the sudden severe increasing onset. And that's why it is important to have both this short-term response and moving into more medium-term and investigating long-term responses. But so what we look at here for looking at long-term is we're looking at other glacier lake outburst flood systems in the region. And there are a couple other of these basins that have been having these outburst floods for decades. And so we see those as a possible analog to this newer system. And what those systems show is that there's a lot of variability on both on the magnitude of the flooding. And so what we're trying to do when we look at medium or long-term solutions is take that variability in flooding that we see in these analog glacier lake outburst systems and use that variability in magnitude of flooding to prepare for a medium-term solution that could be implemented before the 2027 season, and then potentially looking at a longer-term solution that could be implemented over a longer period of years just because of the reality of constructing a large project like that.
Mike Records is a hydraulic engineer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the Alaska District. Daryl Downing is the Mendenhall project manager with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers from the Seattle District. Daryl, let me come back to you. This glacier is in remote, difficult terrain. You're up in Alaska. What are the biggest operational constraints you're dealing with as you're trying to provide both short and medium long-term solutions here?
So one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is logistics, because currently the area that we're working in, all materials have to be either flown in or barged in. There's no central roadway that brings us to the continental United States. So there's a lot of additional planning requirements for both the Corps and the City and Borough of Juneau to identify these materials that will be needed for implementation. Another factor that on the ground teams are dealing with is we're working in people's backyards. So this is something that is very disruptive to them. So we're doing our best to construct something in somebody's backyard with heavy equipment, lots of materials, and we're doing our best not to disrupt their lives any more than we have to, because it's only going to be more and more stressful as the annual flood comes to fruition. So again, we do have people out there talking directly to landowners, to business owners, to make sure that they understand the importance of the work we're doing, and then coordinating with the City and Borough of Juneau to make sure that they are taking a holistic approach to what we are supplementing all their efforts with.
Mike?
Thanks, Terry. And I'll also just add, even from a science perspective, the logistics are really challenging. Like you referenced, it's in Alaska. It's in the mountains of Alaska. It's on a glacier in Alaska. And so a lot of the traditional techniques that scientists use for understanding and monitoring flood problems are particularly tricky here. To get up to this glacier outburst basin, you need a helicopter flight to get up there. The weather is really severe. It's really challenging using traditional monitoring equipment there. The monitoring equipment struggles in severe weather. The glacier is really dynamic. The glacier is changing. The icebergs that calve off the glacier into this basin actually break off the equipment every year. So that's just another piece of the puzzle that makes it even more complicated, is just quantifying and studying so that we know how this system could evolve or grow is very difficult in that remote, mountainous, glaciated terrain.
Mike, speaking from the science and engineering perspective, you just talked about the science challenges, but I'm wondering, in terms of lessons learned from this, we are talking about glaciers in Alaska here, but are there flood control practices that you're learning here that might be applicable in other regions, say inland flooding or coastal flooding from hurricanes or something like that?
Absolutely, Terry. The thing that comes to mind for me right off the bat is how important it has been to work as a team with our other federal and state agencies here. We work every day with the U.S. Geological Survey, every day with the National Weather Service, every day with the University of Alaska, every day with our sponsors, the City and Borough of Juneau and the tribal entity here, Tlingit and Haida. And that really brings together both the scientific component as well as this more like operations component, emergency preparedness. And that team has been so important, leveraging everyone's expertise and knowledge to have the most successful outcome we can.
And Daryl, did you want to add on?
Yes. I also just want to kind of highlight some of the planning support that we've been working with the United States Forest Service on. So as we get additional technical information, our emergency management team is postured to make quick turns to help mitigate these floodings. Forest Service partners have been critical with helping adjust alignments for where we're putting these barriers. So those kind of partnerships that we've been kind of working on over the last few years have been critical to kind of help, again, the Corps pivot in a very rapid response to kind of protect the community as best we can.
And Daryl, I want to wrap up with you. You mentioned earlier you're working in people's backyards, you're working with the local industry and community. From the community's perspective, what are they expecting the Corps of Engineers to do here, and how will they decide whether or not you've been successful?
So I don't necessarily want to speak for the entire community, but I do want to just kind of highlight some of the landowners that we have spoken with. We have generally received a very positive response to our activities. They're extremely appreciative. In some cases, they'll bring out coffee and cookies to our construction team and our quality control reps. But also we have had instances where we have to work through some challenges because, again, these are people's private backyards. So we're doing our best to adjust our construction methods to help fit within their confines of what they live and work in every single day.
And Mike, last word to you.
Absolutely. I think that another thing that people here really appreciate is communication and understanding what we're doing. And an interview like this is a perfect opportunity to provide communication to the communities that we serve.
I've been speaking with Mike Reckerts. He's the hydraulic engineer from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Alaska District. And Daryl Downing is the Mendenhall project manager with the Corps of Engineers Seattle District. Thank you both for joining me today. And thank you for what you're doing up there.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, some of the most important environmental policy work doesn't happen in legislation. It shows up in how agencies act, spend, and measure results. But first, testing new technology is one thing. Making it work in the field and getting people to trust and use it is another. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Testing new technology is one thing, but making it work in real conditions and earning trust is another. USDA's new National Proving Grounds Network is designed to close that gap, testing emerging agriculture technologies on working farms and ranches so that they can move from idea to adoption. Here to explain how that model is taking shape is Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics and Chief Scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Scott Hutchins. Mr. Hutchins, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Terry.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture has just launched a new National Proving Grounds Network for agriculture technology. Tell me what you were hearing from farmers and ranchers that motivated this initiative.
Great question. Well, there was a couple things, not just that we heard, but that we saw, and that was the development and the creation of new innovations and new technologies has just been booming over the last several years, and it's really just at the beginning. So there's going to be a tremendous number of new innovations and opportunities for farmers and ranchers to consider. But unlike many of our past innovations, whether they're traits or whether they're herbicides or insecticides that are highly regulated, the farmer traditionally or typically would get to see those work in the field for multiple years before they ever even have a chance to purchase them. So by the time they're ready to be purchased, they know what they do, they know how they'll fit in their farm, and they know everything about them. In this new digital ag world, in ag tech world, it's largely unregulated, which is a good thing. But what that does mean is that there needs to be some guidance and some opportunity for our farmers and ranchers to understand what these technologies can offer to them so that they know how to make smart investments with their capital and how they might choose the ones that do the best for them on their farm or on their ranch. So what we see there is a slow adoption rate because there is that uncertainty. And what we are all about is trying to reduce the risk, if you will, of not knowing what the technologies can do so that they'll feel comfortable that they're making an investment, whatever investment they make, that they understand that it will be an investment that will help them with their farm or their ranch and its productivity.
You mentioned at the beginning of that traits and herbicides, things that we can imagine we would understand how tall a corn stalk grows or how fat a pig gets, as an example. Herbicides we're familiar with, but what kind of things are we talking about when you say digital agricultural technology?
Certainly. Well, we are in the process of developing a whole range of transformational goals, as we refer to them. So some ones that you might recognize, and we already have a bit of a start as U.S. Agriculture on some of these, but you might think about very precise spraying of weeds, not spraying the crop, but spraying the weed. So imagine, and there'll be multiple ways to do this, but for example, there are technologies already that they call see and spray, where the sensors can actually identify the weed and only spray the areas where the weeds are. So that is one area in weed management, next generation of weed management. There are also technologies where we can do what I refer to as digital scouting. So instead of having an individual walk a field and try to identify where the insects are, where the crop disease is, we can actually identify that from a drone and be able to specifically understand what the infestation or the infections are. There's also technologies being developed for precision nutrition of crops. So you can imagine a scenario where a device identifies exactly what the soil needs in terms of NPK and maybe some micronutrients. And then at the back end of that tractor or that device, they actually put that into the ground right where it's needed. Similarly, with specialty crops, there's a number of opportunities to do automated harvesting, automated processing, automated food safety evaluations. All of these things are possible with the technologies we have, but they just need to be put together in a way that they clearly fit into a farmer rancher's operation. And for animal agriculture, on-animal continuous health monitoring, geofencing done remotely, all of the things that we can do now with satellite technology and so forth to move animals to the most protein-rich farmland or grassland, if you will. So these are just some of the early transformational concepts. It's really as wide as the imagination as we move forward. And every time we develop new capabilities, we have an opportunity to expand that imagination to new solutions for our farmers and ranchers.
I can imagine that there's a lot of interest here, but those all sound really expensive to me. So is part of the purpose of the Proving Ground a little cost-benefit analysis here to say it may cost you this much to buy that technology, but here's the savings down the road?
Great question. Well, actually, I think the jury's out on how expensive they'll be. And the reason why is because the biggest expense for most of the technologies we're used to is the regulatory expense, the timeline that goes with that. So if it takes 10 years to develop a product, there's a lot of sunk cost in that is ultimately recovered on farm. In these technologies, because they're not regulated, actually, while some of the upfront development may be a bit expensive to start, and really, if you think about the journey of getting to market, there's an opportunity to recover that more quickly. But having said that, I think the gist of your question is basically, why will farmers look at this as a positive for them? Part of the Proving Ground concept is not just the technical characterization of the technology, but it's also the return on investment. So we'll be carefully trying to understand what it is if you apply this treatment or if you do this process over a certain area, 20 acres, 40 acres, or whatever. This is what we would expect to be the variable cost for that. So you can now compare weed management in the traditional way to weed management in this proposed way and the various tools that you're evaluating. So this is all about And this is really emanating from our number one priority in USDA in this mission area, and that is to help farms and ranches become more profitable. And that's why we think this technology and this innovation is going to be really a key contributor to that profitability. So return on investment is really at the core of what we're trying to demonstrate.
I'm speaking with Scott Hutchins. He's Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics and Chief Scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So, Mr. Hutchins, help us understand exactly how the network will work. It's going to span farms, ranches, research partners, multiple regions. How will you decide what gets tested and who participates?
Great question. Well, we're right on the front end of that, but there's a couple components that I think will be pretty core in terms of making the determination. The reason we call it a network is because there are really three factors that come into play. The first is the transformational concept, and I've kind of shared with you what some of those examples are. The next would be for what is the crop or the market application for that. So you might think, for example, digital scouting in cotton, right? Cotton is traditionally scouted. It's a professional service that almost all cotton producers use. So the digital scouting application in cotton. Well, the third piece of that is where are you going to do those evaluations? What is that network? Obviously, it would be the Cotton Belt. And now we'll work with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or NIFA, to develop granting programs. So we get proposals from land grant institutions on where those tests could be, how they will be orchestrated, and the rest of it. The protocols and the specific study design will be coming from a central location at USDA so that we ensure we can collect the data together, summarize it together, and provide some common feedback. The other big component for us is the need for a really professional and networked project management office. And we have worked with the Grand Farm in North Dakota to provide that capability. Eminently qualified, very deep already into the startup world and to the ag tech world. And they're going to provide that consistency and deal with a lot of the details that are associated with building that network. But USDA, with the Agriculture Research Service, or ARS, at the tip of the spear, will be leading the overall effort. And then, of course, we'll be using, as I indicated, NIFA to make sure that all of our land grant institutions are brought in and tied to it. And the network will start small, right? Because we have to, go through our own proving ground of the proving ground. But as we learn and we understand what we need to know and how we need to make this efficient and effective, we'll expand rapidly and develop those priorities on a routine basis and execute against it.
It sounds like you'll be testing these new technologies in real live agricultural settings, not some hypothetical test bed farm in a remote location. How are you setting up guardrails so that the innovation can move forward without putting producers or public confidence at risk?
Yeah, and first of all, let me just verify, you're absolutely right. These are going to be in real-world situations, in real-world growing locations, so that they're relevant and that they're credible. We also are going to be working with farmers and ranchers to make sure we understand what their criteria for success look like and ensure that our protocols and our approaches align with that. So that's a key component of this as well, is to make sure that it's real world. We also, by the way, I kind of alluded to it, but we also are going to be working in a pre-commercial mode so that companies who have a start, and a lot of these great startup companies are on the East Coast or the West Coast, they're brilliant people and they have brilliant ideas, but they don't necessarily understand the application to agriculture. And so we're going to work with them in a pre-commercial mode if they're interested, and then help them get over the finish line. So we'll team them up with the researchers at the land grants or through the Agriculture Research Service or other places to help them develop their products. Again, at the end of the day, we want the best products in the hands of our farmers and ranchers so that they benefit first and they benefit the most.
Scott Hutchins is Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics and Chief Scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Thanks so much for joining me and sharing this really exciting concept with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, some of the most important environmental policy work doesn't happen in legislation. It shows up in how agencies act, spend, and measure results. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Shaping environmental outcomes isn't limited to just writing legislation. In many cases, it comes down to knowing how federal decisions actually get made through regulation, procurement, data, and funding choices that shape behavior across the system. That's the approach being taught to climate professionals by Mai Sisla, Senior Climate Policy Advisor at the Aspen Policy Academy. Mai, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're an expert in environmental policy. Let's start there. There's a lot of people working on climate and environmental issues these days, and a lot of them are focused on the science, perhaps without a full understanding of the policy machinery. Where do you see the biggest gaps between the motivated scientific community and their ability to influence policy right now?
Yeah, so great question. One of the biggest gaps that I have seen, especially working with scientific expertise, is thinking about how you can change policy beyond legislation. So I would say 95% of the time when I talk to scientific experts on how they think X, Y, or Z problem should be solved in the policy arena, they will respond, I think a law should be passed that does A, B, or C. And while legislation, of course, is incredibly important, it is very hard to get passed, and it's very hard, especially federally right now, for obvious reasons. So one of the things that we teach, and one of the skills that I really try to impart on people, is what are the other levers that you can pull within government beyond legislation to move policy forward? So can you, for example, affect a regulation? Can you affect how a specific program is run? Can you think about influencing other actors outside of government, whether that's trying to push for a company to do something internally or a foundation? So that, I think, is a big gap that I have seen, is just this idea of how can we think beyond legislation, just because legislation is hard to pass when thinking about policy solutions to a problem.
That makes a lot of sense, and you've probably seen a lot of folks with a lot of different questions. Your Environmental Policy Accelerator is really designed for climate professionals, not career policymakers. So as they get into the process and you start describing all of the different kinds of levers that they might have access to, what kind of response do you typically see?
Yeah, so I think folks are really surprised to learn about all of the different levers that government has to pull to move policy forward. So we also work with technologists in addition to climate scientists. And I think a lot of our technology folks start thinking about and are surprised about how government is a purchaser. They can think about, for example, procurement policy as a way of changing policy. So I think there is just a surprise of how many levers there are, again, beyond legislation, beyond regulation, that folks can pull. I think another thing that we also see, so we also train everyday folks on how to advocate for change within their local communities, in addition to scientific expertise. And I think folks are also surprised at thinking about how they can look at other actors, including, again, companies and philanthropies, and how you can push folks even beyond government to move a particular policy forward.
Within the Aspen Policy Academy, you're getting ready to launch an Environmental Policy Accelerator. Tell us a little bit about what that kind of program is designed to do.
Yeah, so this program, it is both for environmental experts and for everyday people who want to change local environmental policy in their community. And it's really for folks who have a kernel of an idea. So they have some semblance of a policy change that they would like to see either locally or federally or at the state level, but they still need some help workshopping it, figuring out whether this is the right solution, and also figuring out how they can actually advocate for this change to happen. So this program specifically, there's a series of 6 sessions over the course of a few months where we'll teach folks our framework for impacting policy. We have a 6-step process. We essentially will have folks go through each of those 6 steps on an idea that they are particularly excited about, and then by the end get feedback during those sessions. So they'll get feedback from us staffers, but we'll also bring other policy experts in to give them feedback as well. And of course, they'll get feedback from their peers. And then by the end of this program, every single person would have actually identified a solution to a problem that they are passionate about and actually pitch that solution to a decision maker. And they should also have a suite of materials, whether that is, a draft policy, a draft advocacy plan, that they can then use to pitch their solution to the relevant folks.
Mai Sisla is Senior Climate Policy Advisor at the Aspen Policy Academy. Mai, as I read it, some of the recent fellows that you've had go through this program have already had an impact. Maybe they've informed legislation at their state level or or devise some other sort of implementation strategy. What is it that allows these kinds of ideas to move from concept to practice, something lawmakers could actually act on?
Yeah, so one specific skill that I think is really important for these folks that are successful is making sure they actually have a concrete recommendation that a policymaker is able to act on that is explained easily. So for example, we have had a group of fellows who recently were able to impact legislation in Utah focused on data centers. They essentially helped the state of Utah pass a law that mandates that data centers disclose how much water and energy that they're using. One of the reasons that these folks were so successful is they had a really concrete recommendation. They weren't just sitting there admiring the problem of how much energy and water that data centers used. They had a really concrete recommendation that was relatively easy for the state to implement here. So that was really important for them getting their solution across the finish line. And then second of all, they also did a lot of stakeholder mapping. So once they figured out what policy they wanted to move forward, we worked with them to create a stakeholder map of who are the important players at the local level and the state level that they'll need to talk to and they'll need to convince to push this policy forward. So I think that is a second really key important skill is like, how do you stakeholder map and how do you figure out who you need to talk to get a solution forward? And how do you also frame solutions in a way that each of those stakeholders is going to be receptive towards it?
Those sound like key steps in your 6-step framework.
Yes, exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit more, without going through the full training, about what that framework opens up to people?
Yes, so I think it opens up a really clear way on how to advocate for policy change. I think if you talk to most folks, if you even talk to folks who have worked in policy, I think if you ask them, how do you advocate for a policy to get changed? A lot of them don't necessarily have a clear framework in mind. So I think we provide a clear framework that makes it more easily digestible for any person, whether they are a policy expert or just a regular everyday person, on how do you actually create change? So I think having that really clear framework makes it more attainable for folks to be able to do this themselves.
As you think about the role of policy advocates, how has that space changed in the post-Chevron environment?
Yes, so this has changed quite a bit at the federal level. So first I want to say it's important to state that we're still learning how advocacy will change in a post-Chevron environment. So while this core ruling that is now a couple of years old, that courts should no longer defer to agency interpretations is settled, the application itself is still in flux as lower level courts develop new methods for reviewing agency actions. But that being said, there are a couple of key tips that we've been advising folks, especially at the federal level. So to definitely advise folks, if they're thinking about advocating for legislative change, to try and fill in as many details as they possibly can when they're advocating for change. So it's going to become really important for outside advocates to think about, for example, how legislation will be implemented and make sure that detail gets included in the text of a law, since folks are going to be deferring to the text of a law more. Second, if outside advocates want to work with agencies, they should prepare not only to convince agencies that their policy idea is right, but also help those agencies prepare a record to defend against lawsuits. So we've been advising folks to do that as well. And then third, we've been advising NGOs to really expect to work with the courts more in the future. So litigation has, and it's going to continue to become a key advocacy tool for NGOs. But we've also been training NGOs to think about how they can be effective expert witnesses in a case or potentially be named plaintiffs in a court case, for instance. So that's sort of a third level, or thinking about how they're going to interact with the judicial branch.
Where are you seeing advocates have the most success? Is it at the local level, state level, federal level? Does it just sort of depend on the issue that they're bringing forward?
Yeah, so it really depends on the issue. I am a big advocate for folks working on state and local issues generally, because I think there is more room for change. And I also think it tends to be an under-leveraged area in a lot of cases. I think a lot of folks think about federal policy change as being the thing that they want to do, but they don't necessarily think about how local and state governments actually have a very, very important role to play when it comes especially to service provision when you're thinking about things like education policy or criminal justice reform or any of those things. Like a lot of that is happening at the state and local level, and there's a lot more levers there to be pulled than necessarily at the federal level.
So for folks who are interested in environmental policy and maybe want to take advantage of the upcoming accelerator experience, tell us where they can find more information.
Yeah, so they can go to aspenpolicyacademy.org. We have applications open until May 21st. And basically the application is going to ask you what is sort of this kernel of an idea that you're interested in moving forward, but you need help with moving forward. So we're going to ask you to describe that idea a little bit and sort of what you need assistance with. And then we're going to actually be running the program between July and November of this year. So applications are due May 21st, and we'll sort of go through applications, pick a subset of folks, and start the program in July.
Mai Sisla is Senior Climate Policy Advisor at the Aspen Policy Academy. Mai, thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for breaking down this really challenging space for us.
Of course. Thanks again, Terry, for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Agriculture Department employees are suing Secretary Brooke Rollins over what they are calling coercive religious messaging. The lawsuit comes in response to an Easter message that Rollins sent to 100,000 department employees. Plaintiffs say her email implies an in-group religion at USDA and that those who don't agree may face negative consequences. Here with more is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
What kinds of messaging has Secretary Rollins been sending out?
This is something that has built up over time. If you look back to about the summer of last year, that's when Secretary Rollins began sending out these mass messages to USDA employees. The plaintiffs in the lawsuit say that the earlier messages were more non-denominational and a little bit less intense. So, for example, there was a July 4th message where there was a quote in the email saying that may God continue to protect the United States. And then in one sent on Thanksgiving from Rollins, she talked about a gratitude towards a loving God. But then later messages from Rollins showed what the plaintiffs described as an escalating pattern of religious messaging, where she starts using terms like we and our, in a way implying, according to the lawsuit, that there's, some sort of in-group religion, as you mentioned, versus those who might be out or excluded from the type of messaging that she's portraying here.
Some of this sounds like what we hear political leaders say all the time. So what are the plaintiffs arguing in this new legal action? Is there a place where these messages cross a line?
They are saying that the messages, especially the one that was sent on Easter, does cross a line and in a way implies that those who don't share in Rollins' religious views might be subjected to negative consequences. In the lawsuit, they're specifically alleging violations of the First Amendment as well as the Administrative Procedure Act. They say that the messages are coercive, and that, for instance, when a secretary or someone in such a high leadership position sends out an email to all employees, it's expected that the employees are supposed to read it. And if they, perhaps don't agree with her religion, they might feel unwelcome or excluded or potentially have some sort of repercussions in their jobs from not agreeing with her messaging here. The lawsuit also goes on to argue that the messages that the secretary has been sending contradict USDA's own guidance on religious expression in the workplace. There was guidance last November where the department said that USDA officials cannot use authority to pressure subordinates when it comes to religious messaging, and that if employees are having religious conversations, are asked to stop, they must stop. So there's, some questions here about does her messaging, especially this latest message from Easter, does it cross a line with employees, especially given her level of authority at the department?
Have plaintiffs articulated an impact on the employees themselves?
Some of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit did describe their personal experiences with these messages. So, for instance, one of the plaintiffs says that she asked to be removed from the USDA email distribution list because of their religious language. And she was told that her request was not possible. And then she was also told that if she had wanted to elevate her request to a higher USDA office, that would, quote, create trouble for her. So that was some concerning language for that plaintiff. And then a separate employee who is involved in the lawsuit says that she felt pressured to pretend that she is Christian if she wants to advance her career at USDA. So it seems like the general feeling here is that it goes beyond simply a religious expression, and it's sort of pushing or coercing a specific religion or a specific message onto employees who may or may not disagree with what's being said.
Drew, the Trump administration has been trying to advance, if we could use air quotes, a Christian agenda across a number of fronts. How does this fit in with that broader agenda?
There has been a lot of talk and a lot of, pushing of religious expression and the promotion of that freedom in the federal workplace specifically. This really comes back to an executive order that President Trump signed in February last year, where he created a task force that was supposed to identify, root out, eliminate anything that could be seen as, quote, anti-Christian, that could include any agency policies or practices or conduct. Since that executive order was released, the Office of Personnel Management has followed up with more detailed guidance, essentially saying that federal employees really should be allowed to express their religion at work as long as it doesn't interfere with day-to-day work or operations. They've also encouraged agencies to grant telework exemptions to federal employees if they are wanting to celebrate a religious holiday or for other religious purposes. So there's, definitely this push to have religious expression in the workplace. It's something that we've seen not only from Rollins and her messaging, but other leaders like Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio, I believe, have also had some, religious messaging in their public engagements as well.
So what happens to this case next?
Well, it was just filed recently, so it's, as any lawsuit, it may take a while for us to see any changes here, but essentially what these employees are trying to accomplish is to get the secretary to stop sending these messages out. The agency, USDA, did not want to comment on the pending litigation, so it's not really clear what the next steps will be, but it's something that, these employees have raised serious concerns about, so I'd imagine we'll see some developments in the months ahead.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for this story.
Absolutely. Thanks, Terry.
You can find all the details at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.